On March the 23rd, 2013, inside a large country house in Berkshire, England, an employee became concerned when he could not reach the man who lived there. The house was quiet. Eventually, his bodyguard forced open the locked bathroom door. Inside, 67-year-old Boris Berezovsky was lying dead on the floor. A cashmere scarf was around his neck. Police found no immediate evidence of a struggle, and investigators would later say that Berezovsky's injuries were consistent with hanging. But when the case reached the coroner, the evidence would not produce a definitive conclusion. The official verdict was left open. 14 years earlier, the man lying on that bathroom floor had been one of the most powerful businessmen in Russia and had helped Vladimir Putin rise to the presidency. To understand what happened, it is necessary to return to Russia in the early 1990s. In December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The country that emerged from its collapse inherited an enormous economy built around state ownership. Oil fields, mines, factories, airlines, banks, and television networks had spent decades under government control. Now Russia's new leaders were attempting to transform that system into a market economy. And they were trying to do it extraordinarily quickly. State companies were privatized, prices were liberalized, restrictions on private enterprise disappeared. Assets that had never really had a market price suddenly had to be valued, divided, and sold. But the institutions needed to regulate this new economy were still developing. Russia had few of the mechanisms that mature capitalist economies had built over generations. Corporate governance was weak. Financial markets were primitive. Property rights could be uncertain, and the legal system struggled to keep pace with the speed of economic change. Inflation destroyed much of the population's savings. Businesses changed hands rapidly. Fortunes could be created and lost in a matter of months. And access could sometimes be more valuable than capital. Knowing the right banker could provide financing. Knowing the right government official could provide access to an asset. Controlling a television station could provide something even more valuable: political influence. By the middle of the decade, another problem had emerged. The Russian government desperately needed money. One response became known as the Loans for Shares program. Private banks provided loans to the state, while stakes in some of Russia's largest natural resource companies were offered as collateral. When the government failed to repay those loans, control of several enormously valuable companies passed into private hands, often through auctions later criticized for favoring insiders. Within only a few years, a small group of businessmen had accumulated extraordinary wealth. They controlled oil companies, metals producers, banks, airlines, and television networks. Their economic influence increasingly translated into political influence, particularly as President Boris Yeltsin approached a difficult re-election campaign in 1996. Newspapers and television channels became political weapons. Businessmen financed campaigns and developed relationships inside the Kremlin. Russia had created capitalism, but it had also created something more unusual: a system in which a handful of private businessmen could accumulate enough money, media influence, and political access to affect decisions at the highest levels of the state. They would eventually become known around the world as the Russian oligarchs. And among the businessmen emerging from this new Russia was a former mathematician named Boris Berezovsky. Boris Berezovsky began his career far from politics. He was a mathematician, trained in applied mathematics and decision-making, who spent years working in Soviet research institutions. But as the Soviet economy began opening to private enterprise in the late 1980s, he moved into business. In 1989, he helped establish Logovaz, a company connected to Avtovaz, the manufacturer of the Lada. Russia's transition to capitalism created enormous pricing distortions, and Logovaz profited from them. Berezovsky became wealthy, then expanded into banking, aviation, oil, and media. His most important asset was television. Through ORT, one of Russia's largest television networks, Berezovsky gained access to millions of viewers and increasingly to the Kremlin itself. In 1996, President Boris Yeltsin faced a difficult re-election campaign against communist candidate Gennady Zyuganov. Berezovsky and other powerful businessmen backed Yeltsin, using money, political connections, and media influence to support his campaign. Yeltsin won. Berezovsky moved closer to the center of power, becoming associated with the informal circle around the president known as the family. By the end of the decade, he had become much more than a businessman. He was one of the oligarchs who had discovered that, in the new Russia, wealth could create political influence, and political influence could protect wealth. But Yeltsin was becoming increasingly weak and unpopular. Soon, the Kremlin would need a successor. One of the men being considered was Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer whose political rise had been remarkably fast. In 1998, Yeltsin appointed him director of the FSB. The following year, he became prime minister. To most Russians, Putin was still relatively unknown. Berezovsky supported him. ORT gave Putin favorable coverage, while Kremlin-aligned political forces attacked his rivals. On December 31, 1999, Yeltsin resigned and Putin became acting president. 3 months later, he won the election. Berezovsky appears to have believed that Putin would preserve the system created under Yeltsin, where oligarchs could influence government while maintaining enormous business empires. Instead, Putin began changing the rules. In July 2000, he met Russia's leading businessmen and made clear that they could keep their wealth, but they were expected to stay out of national politics. Berezovsky refused to accept that arrangement. The conflict became increasingly public, particularly after ORT criticized Putin's handling of the Kursk submarine disaster. By the end of 2000, Berezovsky had left Russia. He eventually settled in Britain and received political asylum in 2003. From London, he became one of Putin's most outspoken opponents, financing opposition activities and publicly attacking the Kremlin. The businessman who had once helped Putin reach power was now trying to remove him from it. Berezovsky's position weakened dramatically during his years in exile. One of the most important blows came from Roman Abramovich. In 2011, Berezovsky sued Abramovich in London, claiming that he had been forced to sell valuable interests connected to Sibneft for far less than they were worth. Berezovsky said they had effectively been business partners. Abramovich argued that Berezovsky had never owned the stake he claimed, and that payments made to him were instead for political protection. The case exposed how informal Russian business had been during the 1990s, when major deals were often based on relationships and verbal agreements rather than clear documentation. In August 2012, Berezovsky lost the case. The judge rejected his claims and described him as an unreliable witness. The defeat was financially devastating. He agreed to pay £35 million toward Abramovich's legal costs, while divorce settlements and other litigation added further pressure. Assets were sold, and a fortune once measured in billions was shrinking rapidly. By early 2013, reports described Berezovsky as increasingly isolated and financially troubled. There were also reports that he had written to Putin, possibly apologizing and asking to return to Russia, although the exact contents of the letter were never made public. The contrast was striking. Putin remained firmly in control of Russia. Abramovich remained enormously wealthy. Berezovsky's political network and much of his fortune had disappeared. Then on March 23, 2013, he stopped answering his phone. Berezovsky was living near Ascot in Berkshire, England. When an employee could not reach him, his bodyguard eventually forced open the bathroom door. Berezovsky was found dead on the floor. A cashmere scarf was around his neck, and another piece of material was attached to the shower rail. He was 67 years old. Because of his history, speculation began immediately. Berezovsky had spent more than a decade attacking Vladimir Putin. His associate Alexander Litvinenko, had been murdered in London with radioactive polonium-210. Berezovsky himself had previously been the target of a suspected assassination plot, but investigators found no evidence of third-party involvement. A post-mortem examination concluded that his death was consistent with hanging. The case, however, did not end there. At the inquest, experts disagreed over aspects of the forensic evidence. A pathologist hired by Berezovsky's family challenged parts of the official interpretation. In the end, the coroner said she could not determine whether Berezovsky had taken his own life or whether someone else had been involved. The verdict was left open. The investigation established how he had been found, but not with certainty why he had died. Berezovsky's death was not the only case to raise questions around wealthy Russians and Kremlin opponents, particularly those living abroad. Alexander Litvinenko, a close associate of Berezovsky, had already been murdered with radioactive polonium in London in 2006. Georgian billionaire Badri Patarkatsishvili, Berezovsky's former business partner, died suddenly at his home in England in 2008, although investigators found that he suffered from severe heart disease. Russian financier Alexander Perepelichny collapsed and died while jogging in Surrey in 2012, after reportedly providing information connected to Russian financial crimes. In the years that followed, other Russian businessmen, officials, and Kremlin critics would die in violent, sudden, or unusual circumstances, both inside Russia and abroad. These deaths had different causes, different investigations, and very different levels of evidence, and there is no basis to simply treat them as part of a single campaign. But their frequency, combined with several documented assassinations and poisoning attempts, created an enduring atmosphere of suspicion around the intersection of Russian wealth, political exile, and state power.